So I'm gonna read the first few pages from my second book. It's a novel and it's called Strange Charm. The World According to Skoda. Life on Earth has gone through two extraordinary revolutions. The first, of course, was its very creation. How non-living molecules, who are still so very full of an energy and movement all their own, came to take on the complex structures of the building block of organic life is outside the scope of this book. What is important to note is that it happened, and that it happened spontaneously. The average person does not give too much thought to this fact, or to the fact that everything around them can be neatly carved up into the categories alive and not alive, regardless of how fuzzy the line dividing them may be. What is a marvel is that at some point in the not-too-distant cosmic past, these two categories did not even exist. Nothing was alive, and the very concept of life was incomprehensible to the atoms zooming around every which way of their own mobile yet deterministic accord. The second revolution came in the form of consciousness. Now, before we get started, it is important to note that there are really two forms of consciousness that we should separate. There is the term conscious as in awake or aware. This form of consciousness is existent in all forms of animal life and perhaps even some forms of plant life, not even to mention the fungi. This form of consciousness is best understood by referencing its antithesis. When an entity is unconscious, it is still alive, but has lost its connection with its waking life. No one would argue that a dog does not possess this form of consciousness during its daily hours. But this form of consciousness, while incredible, does not capture the full magnitude of just how revolutionary this second change is. Consciousness with a capital C describes something much deeper than the mere state of wakefulness and awareness. Consciousness, as inhabited by humans, refers to the state of self-awareness that reaches its apex within the human mind. The ability to reflect on the self, the past, the future, and all aspects of identity is key to what makes humans human. More so than speech, more so than opposable thumbs, this feature is what separates humans from other creatures. And just as before, in the not so distant past, there was no consciousness to be embodied in the form of humans. There were no categories to draw between the self-aware and the unself-aware because the self did not exist as it does now. Just as the line between alive and not alive is a shifting one, so too is the line between self-aware and not self-aware. This line is more like a spectrum, really. We can see it take form in two analogous systems. The first system is the categorization of animals from seemingly unconscious to clearly conscious. A dragonfly, while swift and sure, does not seem to possess much in the way of understanding selfhood, at least not to the biased observer that is mankind. It may understand its position or feel hunger, but it seems hard to imagine it considering deeper questions of its future and legacy. Mice seem similarly prone to the whims of need, but perhaps due to their familial and mammal natures, have more of a conception of self. Surely cats and dogs have awareness of more than their basic needs. The anthropomorphic imposition of perceived traits like loyalty and love onto our house pets might say more about humans than it does about animals, though it is without a doubt that we can see evidence of greater self-awareness in terms of planning the future and remembering past events in the wild versions of them, namely the wolves and the lions. Whatever the fullness of consciousness in animals, it is even clearer to see the development of self-awareness in an analogous spectrum. The development of consciousness within a single human's lifetime is an excellent look into the slippery concept that is the self. A single child goes through more development in the first 10 years of their life than they may encounter throughout the rest of them, at least from a neuroscientific perspective. A baby seems to possess no concept of self-awareness. They scream when they have needs, they react to the voice of their mother, they ogle at colors and movement. But the awareness of self as self rather than self as body seems limited. It is only later into childhood when a person discovers that there is a full life behind their name. Even then, with each passing year, they come to know themselves more fully, can ascertain where desires come from, can unpack past events and their effects on their personalities and psyches. A fully conscious self emerges with adulthood, and then is usually all but forgotten, except perhaps during therapy. More often, humans embody their selves rather than inspecting them. But the self, more than perhaps self-awareness or consciousness, is what is truly interesting. Like the development of life, it came from nothing, appeared from thin air as it seems. The spontaneous generation isn't to say that it occurred overnight, but rather that due to nothing more than a random arrangement of particles over time, these two entities, life and consciousness, developed of their own. Religious theorizing aside, this is what science has told us, or rather has not told us. We do not have full explanations or timelines for the development of life or self-awareness, and we most likely never will. But what we can see is that before there was life, there was unlife. And before there was the self, there was the unself. Unliving, unthinking matter precedes all else in this universe on this planet. There was a time before humans existed. This time of the is important to note because we are currently living within one, or rather we had been until last Thursday. Once something exists within the world, it is hard to imagine a time before its introduction. Humans become accustomed to new technology, the phone, the microwave, Coca-Cola. We cannot envision a time or space where the things we utilize did not exist. Surely we understand that logically there existed a time when the world as we know it was different. Just yesterday there existed different objects and concepts than we have today. And this is true every day. Consistently things are changing and new concepts and objects are being invented. But the broad psychological shift necessary to understand that the past was indeed different, not only quantitatively in terms of the presence of new things, but qualitatively due to their lack, is a challenging one. It is not just that things were different in the past because objects or concepts were not present. They were different because those things had yet to be conceived mentally or physically. What do I mean by this? Why does this all matter? Let's say that tomorrow all cell phones magically disappear and can never reappear. No one can create a phone again. The technology and blueprints for telecommunication of any sort will have vanished from computers and minds of humans everywhere. There are and will be no more phones. Now conceptually, people will still know about phones. Even once they have been gone for a decade, the memory of phones will still be present, much in the same way that my loose memory of cassette players still exists. However, the way in which people perceive of time before phones is much in the same way that we might now conceive of a future time without cell phones. Hindsight is an incredibly powerful tool. We always assume we are smarter and more knowledgeable than past humans. However, we always see the past through a lens of knowledge about what exists in the present. To conceive of transporting yourself back in time to a time without having knowledge of the technology of the present seems impossible. What do we not know of that exists 5 years from now? We cannot even imagine what might transpire or exist. This is all relevant for our discussion of life and consciousness. We need to transport ourselves back billions of years and remember that the possibility of either of these things was not foreseeable at all. It is just as likely that life never happened or that life happened in a radically different way. In the same way that it could have been cats rather than the primates that developed full self-awareness and became the dominant species ruling the earth, so too could life have looked very different. These kinds of thought experiments are necessary to prepare yourself to understand what happened last Thursday and why it so radically changed everything we may know about life and existence. It may not be the first instance of its kind of revolution, as we will see throughout these chapters, but it was the first public admission in recent history of a recognition that things may not be as they seem, and we may not know how everything works. Before we begin on our narrative journey, it's important to note exactly what this third revolution, as I shall call it after the first and second revolutions of life and self-awareness, really is. But first, I want to make sure you understand exactly why those first two revolutions were so powerful. Everything about the world changed when life and consciousness took center stage. The very core of what was considered possible in the system, that is the universe, radically shifted. If there had been an outside observer with the power of thought to see the world as it developed life and then self-awareness, they would have been radically unprepared each time. In the same way that the cell phone of the future is impossible for me to predict now, as it must have been to people a short 100 years ago, these great leaps in the development of the possible are elusive and incredible. Technologically, the only changes of magnitude even remotely similar to these first two revolutions in earthly existence were the discovery and usage of electricity, and later, the internet. So this third revolution, you ask, what is it? What is as inconceivable and globally important as the development of life and the development of self-awareness? The story I'm about to unravel for you is the story of telepathy. And before you huff away, I ask you to suspend your disbelief in everything you may know or think you know about the topic, and remember just how absurd the development of life would have seemed to you if you had been present for its inception eons ago. I'm here to prepare you for this story, and to remember that before life there was none, and before consciousness there was only unconscious entities. So too is the development of telepathy not only possible, but also the very real development of one person in this story. Instead of being skeptical, think for a moment. What would you do if one morning you woke up to discover that you could hear the thoughts of the loved one in bed next to you? If you could feel viscerally their emotions in your own body, what would you do? How would you respond? I invite you to put yourself in the shoes of the main character before you even begin reading their story. Perhaps then you will be less wary of the journey you are about to embark on, or perhaps you will be even more uncomfortable. Either way, it is a question worth considering. Without the aid of hindsight or foresight into the future, it is hard to have an understanding of the now. How something you experience may change the world around you, or how a new concept or development may change history radically. We can never know just how powerful our own personal experiences and contributions can be to everyone else in existence. One person's invention can change the rest of time and space. One molecule's binding can alter all of reality and what is possible. Similarly, one day in the life of a person can change the entire rest of history forever. That is the dilemma our main character faced last Thursday, and that is the dilemma that we too find ourselves in as observers privy to the world's experiment that is the Third Revolution. Cool. So that's the first bit, and then the rest is obviously not an essay. It's a narrative story about the main character and his interactions with a bunch of other people. But yeah, it's a really interesting story, and I had a lot of fun writing it. It took 8 days to write. So it's this kind of like manic fever dream of a book, and I'll be sharing, more chapters and readings later as I go through editing.